We get asked hundreds of questions every day from people just like you wondering what it's like to live in southern Maine. So that's exactly what we're going to cover in today's video. You guys ask questions, I'm going to answer them. These are some of our more frequently asked questions about what it's like to live here, why people build so close to the beach, what's going on with all this coastal flooding, so let's get into it. By the way, my name's Margaret. My dad, Michael, and I make videos to educate you about living in the southern Maine area. If you have any questions, feel free to give us a call, shoot us a text, send us an email. All of our information is down below, as well as some free downloadable resources for you to use as well. So question one, why do people build houses so close to the beach? And there is a couple of answers to this one. The main one being just that, A, the beach is beautiful, people want to live there. A lot of Maine's high-end properties are right on the coast. That's not to say all of them, but definitely a huge portion of them are right on our coast. And people want to live there because the ocean is a really desirable place to live. So obviously people are going to continue to try and build homes on the beach or remodel homes on the beach. And especially with a lot of the coastal storms we've gotten in the past couple of years, you're now seeing people build or basically lift up their homes so that they don't experience flooding. Another answer to this question is just that the coast didn't always look the way that it does now. Obviously, in more recent years, in the past couple of decades, the coast has experienced quite a bit of erosion, and so the coastline just doesn't look the same. There wasn't always this imminent threat of your house being taken out by a storm or flooding, and so people weren't necessarily as scared to build on the beach. And to be honest, you shouldn't necessarily be now. You can always, if you're buying a house or you have the funds, you can lift the house up. There are different systems you can put in place to prevent the flooding. Not all areas on the coast necessarily even flood or necessarily flood as much as other areas of the coast. You just have to do your research and decide if that is the right purchase for you. Question number two, is swimming in the summer decent up there? I know the water is colder than further south, and that kind of answers the question for you. The water in the summertime at least obviously isn't as cold as in the winter. I would never really say our water gets warm in comparison to other areas of the country like Florida. It definitely gets warmer than it does in the winter when it's freezing. It's refreshing in the summertime. You can definitely swim in it. It's nice to swim in, but it's definitely not warm like you're thinking in Florida. It's definitely a bit cooler. And our next question is, do the shops close in the winter like some of the other towns? Does Saco have pretty autumn foliage? I'm considering moving to Saco from Texas. I love Maine. I'm debating between Maine or Vermont. Now there's a couple of questions in here. The first one being, do the shops close in the winter like some of the other towns? The answer is sometimes, and it depends on where you live. Now, the shops obviously close, or some of them close, as our tourist season ends nowadays kind of in October. It used to be at the end of summer, but now we get some people who want to visit in the fall as well. But there are some shops where it's just not feasible if they're geared towards tourists and or just the business isn't really working for them in the winter. It's more feasible for them to shut down for a few months in the winter. And while it can be a little bit frustrating for the locals, that's just kind of the nature of living in an area that is reliant on tourism. So yes, there are shops that close down, but more and more in the past couple of years, you're seeing more restaurants and shops and local businesses stay open for the full year, as we do have a lot of people moving here, and we are getting people visiting during those winter months for things like Prelude, different Christmas festivals, as a lot of our tourists only live in Maine or not Maine, in Massachusetts or New York. So people that have vacation homes here and or they just want to drive to come up to Maine, a lot of them are not as far away as we may think. So a lot of shops are staying open year round. There are definitely some that close. Again, it kind of depends on what area of the state you live in though as well. And then, does Saco have pretty autumn foliage? Yes, it does. Maine in general, really New England in general, but I like to say Maine specifically, has beautiful autumn foliage. And then to talk about that last part, I'm debating between Maine or Vermont. They're very similar. I would say Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont are all pretty similar states to live in. Obviously, the laws are different. There's going to be a difference in scenery depending on where you live in the states. Generally speaking, if I'm being honest, if you like Maine, you'll probably like New Hampshire or Vermont as well, unless there are, specific laws, as this applies to, quite a few people. If there's specific laws in one state or the other that you like or dislike, there are definitely differences. Generally speaking, when it comes to lifestyle and kind of what your day-to-day life looks like, it's going to be similar in all of those states. If you're looking to kind of experience more of that coastal living lifestyle, Maine definitely has the biggest coastline, so that's a huge pull to the state. There's a little bit more wiggle room, a little bit more area to move around as the state's just a little bit bigger, and the vast majority of our state is still undeveloped, and people like that a lot about Maine too. Our next question, which we get a lot, would be, I have to ask if there are bears around there, and what about moose? And yes, there are bears. Yes, there are moose, bears. At least in York County, you're probably going to see a bear more than a moose. I can speak for, me and a lot of the people that I know. We've seen bears in our backyards before or on the roads before. It's not common, but we've seen them. You're probably not going to see a moose unless you're going camping or driving up the state a little bit. A moose definitely is not something that's as common to see, though they are definitely here, and you'll probably see one in your lifetime if you live here. Our next question is in reference to coastal flooding. So how often does this happen, yearly or every decade? And the answer to that is yearly. Coastal flooding happens pretty much every year in some capacity. We're not getting these massive hurricane floods that are disastrous and taking people's lives like they are in certain areas of the South, but we definitely do experience coastal flooding. Some years are worse than others. Some storms are worse than others. There are certain areas of the beach that flood regularly. Other areas of the beach only ever really flood if there's a massive coastal storm. But yeah, flooding happens fairly regularly. It's not necessarily a big deal, especially if your house is built up or it's up on pilings, if it's in areas of the beach that are higher. But if your house is on a lower area of the beach, it's not on pilings, and it's directly on the ocean, right up against a seawall, it's probably going to get hit pretty hard, and it's likely going to flood. The flooding doesn't really stop, I would say, really much of anything going on in the towns. I can primarily speak for Wells because that's where I've lived and grown up. But for us, the coastal flooding really only takes place on one side of Route 1. Wells is set up so basically a lot of the coastal homes are essentially on like an island or a peninsula. And the waves, obviously, being that there's the ocean, the island, the marsh, and then really the rest of the land, the state. Really, the only area that gets affected by the flooding is that island or that peninsula that sticks out, that's right up against the ocean. So generally speaking, day-to-day life doesn't really get affected by flooding. Even if you live in an area or a town that floods, it's really only going to affect you if you have a vacation home on the beach, which you're likely not living in when the flooding's happening, as it typically happens in those winter months when it's really cold, like January, February. But there are people that live on the beach year-round, and they do get affected by the floods. The roads typically get blocked off if the storm is really bad, and sometimes people are asked to only basically stay down there in the case of emergency if you don't have anywhere to go. But the majority of the population that lives in Wells is not super greatly affected by those coastal storms, unless of course you own property right there on the beach. All right, our next question is about power outages in Maine. So one thing you mentioned was the power and internet outages. I say this with the utmost respect, but how does the state that knows it's going to get a ton of snow and ice not have a better setup to minimize that? Especially given that there are, from what I understand, very limited jobs outside of tourism. Lack of internet can be a huge deterrent for those working remotely to move to Maine. I know you guys don't want non-Mainers moving there, but wouldn't that aid the local economy? Now, there's a couple of things I want to touch on here, and the reason why the state can't necessarily be better set up to minimize these things is the internet isn't just going out during a storm. It's going out because a tree is falling on a power line, the internet gets wiped out for, a good chunk of homes in the area. And because Maine is so heavily forested, really the only way to prevent the power from going out would be to take down a bunch of trees, which isn't what we want to do. And while I'm sure there's ways that I haven't thought of, that other people haven't thought of to minimize these power outages, like I said, a big portion of why these internet outages are happening is because of the trees falling on the power lines. It's kind of inevitable. We don't really lose power super often in Maine. I would say maybe like once or twice throughout the winter we might have a bad storm. Your area of town may or may not lose power. If you have a generator, great. If you don't, unfortunately, sometimes during those really bad storms, it could be out for a couple of days. It's just kind of something you have to prepare for living in an area like Maine, the whole state, pretty much as a whole, that has a lot of trees, a lot of forest. And during those big storms, you kind of just have to expect the power to go out from time to time. The next thing I wanted to touch on with this is there are very limited jobs outside of tourism. There are definitely jobs from tourism that are created, but there's also plenty of jobs that have absolutely nothing to do with tourism here. Now, it's no secret that Maine does not have the best job market. There aren't as many jobs in Maine as there are, say, an hour and a half south in Boston. A lot of people do commute from Maine or take the train in from Maine down to Boston for the day to work, but that's not to say that the majority of our jobs are related to tourism. I agree with the statement that a lack of internet could be a huge deterrent for those working remotely. I agree, but also we don't really lose power super often, so it's not necessarily a massive deterrent. As somebody who works for a brokerage that is completely remote, a lot of my work is remote. Making videos for you guys is a remote job as well. I still live in Maine, and this very rarely ever affects me. And then the last comment of, I know you guys don't want non-Mainers moving there, but wouldn't that aid the local economy? There is a bit of a stigma that people from out of state are not wanted in Maine. I've had multiple people approach me about feeling like they're not necessarily welcome when moving to the area, and that's so unfortunate. There are definitely people that feel a certain way about the change of lots of people moving to Maine all at once. In the past couple of years, we've had tons of people moving to the area. Not everybody's as accepting and open to change as other people are. At the end of the day, if you're moving here for a better life for yourself, you're respectful to the people around you and where you're living. People are not going to be mean to you. And that's a very small percentage of the population. There are still plenty of people that will welcome you to the area. Our next question is about the temperatures in Maine. So what are the typical lowest temperatures in coastal Maine in the winter? Thank you. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of Googling for this one really quick. Okay, so the winter average temperatures range from 25 degrees Fahrenheit in the far south to less than 15 degrees Fahrenheit in the northern and interior portions of the state. Now, this is different year to year. We have winters that are warmer than others, winters that are colder than others. Generally speaking, I would say that's very accurate, the average temperature being roughly, 25 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter. We do have winters where it gets down to 0 degrees or sometimes slightly into the negatives for periods of time. That's not uncommon to see, but during the daytime, for a good chunk of the winter, it does sit around 25 degrees. Now, obviously, in the more northern areas of the state, it's going to be a little bit colder as you're further north. But at least down here in York County, I would say 25 degrees, fairly accurate. But it's also important to note that if you live directly in one of those coastal towns, not a town back, but say Wells, for example. If you live in Wells, it's probably going to be about 10 degrees colder in Wells during the day, in the winter, really, and in the summer too, than it is in Sanford, which is right next door, basically one town removed from the coast, because we get a lot of that wind coming in from the ocean. And while this isn't really a big deal, it's a difference of 10 degrees if it's windy, and it's probably a little bit more noticeable in the winter, but it's something to keep in mind. And then our last question is, what is she really hiding? I'm hiding absolutely nothing. That's exactly why we have this channel, to be super transparent about what it's like to live in southern Maine. We want to share exactly what it looks like here so that you guys can get really the best understanding of what it's like to be here. The last thing we want is for people to not know what they're getting themselves into and moving to the area basically just jumping right into the move without really knowing what it's like. Maine is very different in the winter than it is in the summer. Living in Maine is slightly different than living in New Hampshire or other areas of northern New England. We really want to be super transparent about what it's like to be here so that you can make an educated decision about if this is the right place for you to move, if it's the right place for you to vacation, if it's the right place for you to raise a family, and so much more. Educating you is our number one goal, and being super honest about all things Maine is exactly what we're trying to provide for you guys. So those were our most frequently asked questions about what it's like to live in southern Maine. I hope you guys found this video helpful. And again, my name's Margaret. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. All of our information is down below, as well as some free downloadable resources for you to use as well. And we'll see you next time.